to both of you. It's cool to actually have both of you. Right? It's a good way to end the event. Okay, and we'll be starting with Mr. Ruffulo. Crime is the first
Opening statement.
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I'll get the hang of this. Would you like to give your opening statement?
Like right now?
Yeah.
You're sure?
Right now.
I don't want to short circuit any other thing you got going on.
You never know.
Okay. First, good evening, everyone. In 2004, I was in Baghdad. And as I'm standing on a street corner, there's a young woman and her child walking from a tenement into a store to shop. And I looked at my interpreter, I said, wow, that's great. And he said, sir, that only happened because you guys are here. Because for the last 30 years, women could not walk outside in their own neighborhoods without a male escort. So when we talk about crime, since that's the next question, I'm going to kind of caveat, we don't want that to happen here. This month is Military Appreciation Month, so thank you for all of you that extend good wishes to the military. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be on stage finally, and actually we can have a discussion. And I want to thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Bull Run Republican Women's Club for hosting this. This is an incredibly important opportunity to share our views and just have conversation and dialogue, which is so often missed in politics today. Good evening to all of you. My name is Bill Woolf. I'm a father, I'm a former police officer, a gang detective, FBI task force officer, director of the Office of Victims of Crime, and a special advisor to the White House. And I'm proud today to also be the endorsed candidate by our governor, Glenn Youngkin.
No applause.
We're not having that during the debate. Go ahead.
Okay. So, my grandfather and father served as police officers here before me. I was proud to be the third generation to continue that service to our community, and I now hope to be able to continue my service as your next state senator here in District 30. We have a big choice to make in November, and I'm here to pledge to you that if you send me to Richmond, I will keep your families safe. I will make sure that your taxes are low. I will make sure that we have a transportation system that works for us and you're not taxed off the roads. And most importantly, I will make sure that parents make the decisions for their children and how they raise their families. We have to take back the Senate. We have to be able to support our governor in the work that he's doing down there. As my colleague John Sturr mentioned in the beginning, every bill that the Republicans put forward to bring good to our communities was blocked by the Senate. In the last 123 years, the Republicans have only controlled the Senate for about 12 of those years. Friends, it's time to take the Senate back and bring common sense, safety to our communities. Thank you.
Thank you both for your opening statements. We're now going to proceed with the questions. And Mr. Woolf, you will get the first question. In 2020, Democratic Senator Scott Surreville proposed Senate Bill 5032, which would have eliminated mandatory jail time for an assault on a police officer, judge, or other law enforcement official, and would have allowed the charge to be reduced to a Class 1 misdemeanor. The bill passed the Senate, but was killed by the House. What is your position on this bill? And what is your position if it was a juvenile who committed the assault? Specifically, how would you work in Richmond to pass or to kill this or similar legislation?
Patty, thank you for that question. I have to tell you that hits me at home because as a police officer, I was a victim. There were multiple times when I was assaulted by suspects when I was trying to take them into custody, and one time one of them tried to run me over with a car. I have to tell you, from my personal experience, I absolutely think the penalties should be higher than they are now. Our law enforcement officers go out every day. They put on a badge and a uniform and take an oath to protect us in this community. And we have to have their backs. That is non-negotiable at any point. My little brother still serves as a police officer today here in Prince William County, and I will fight to make sure that the laws support his ability to protect this community. Now, we've seen crime rise, particularly among our younger population, among our juveniles. I was talking to some gang reduction specialists the other day, and they said we're seeing more and more young kids being recruited into gangs, being engaged in violent crime, carrying firearms. But they are still juveniles, and I think one of the unique things about Virginia is understanding the juvenile justice system is set up with dispositional alternatives. The juvenile justice system is set up to try to provide that child with a pathway forward. And when all other options are exhausted, then we can treat them like adults. So I think that we need to strengthen and put more resources into the juvenile justice system, understanding what's been set up and how it is to respond to the juveniles. But when it comes to adults assaulting police officers, there is no room for debate. Thank you.
Mr. Ruffulo, I'm going to read the question again. In 2020, Democratic Senator Scott Surville proposed Senate Bill 5032, which would have eliminated mandatory jail time for an assault on a police officer, judge, or other law enforcement official, and would have allowed the charge to be reduced to a Class 1 misdemeanor. The bill passed the Senate, but was killed by the House. What is your position on this bill? And what is your position if it was a juvenile who committed the assault?
I think that you, both at the county level and at the state level, have to work together. So the first thing I would do would be vote mattlowry.com, because you have to have an advocate at this level that can help ensure that the law is followed, but also work with the judges to ensure that the sentences are appropriate. The second thing I would do is I prefer prevention. So part of the problem with juveniles is what's happening in the schools. There is not enough resources in the schools. You have to give them an alternative, like after-school programs, because you have to educate them, teach them, and give them something else to do to get them off the street first. The second thing I would do would be legislation, stricter legislation at the state level, and we have to ensure that any offense against a law enforcement officer, whether that's a fireman, whether that's a policeman, or whether that's a first responder, an ambulance worker, is strictly adhered to and is enforced.
Okay.
Can I, one other point?
If you have to, go ahead.
287G, I would actually legislate that at the state level, because part of the problem happens to be people that come into the country that maybe shouldn't be in the country, and those people, child of two immigrants, the people that are committing these crimes shouldn't be in America. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to the second question, which will first go to Mr. Ruffulo. With the growth of solar farms, how would you balance the need for forest land and farmland to produce food, both livestock and crops? Given the toxic waste created from the production and disposal of solar panels, would you support halting the construction of solar farms until a suitable solution is found?
I'm not sure that we're going to get to a suitable solution with this kind of production, because the types of materials that you have to use are, by their very nature, toxic and pollutants. We already know that the Occoquan watershed is highly polluted at the end, and we haven't even begun to really do this type of production yet. So I think that you need to look at alternative methods of power production, especially when you talk about data centers. We don't have the appropriate amount of energy that we need, and that the only result that you can have and the only way to get there is through nuclear power. And that's not a clean solution, but it's a cleaner solution than doing industrial production and polluting current farmland. I think if you want to talk about farmland, there's great land in Virginia, and I think more money of our $3 billion should be spent to incentivize farmers and to be incentivize small business people to actually invest in this kind of thing.
I realize now that on the last question, I missed the rebuttal. We're gonna circle back and do that, but I wanna go ahead and give this energy question to Mr. Woolf. We'll complete that, then we'll have rebuttals on both, okay? In 2020, with the growth of solar farms, how would you balance the need for forest land and farmland to produce food, both livestock and crops? Given the toxic waste created from the production and disposal of solar panels, would you support halting the construction of solar farms till a suitable solution is found?
Thank you, Patty. I think that we have to be mindful that the cure cannot be worse than the problem. And I think we look at solar farms, the amount of pollution that they create, particularly with regards to the large blades. When those blades break, when they become unusable because a flock of birds have run into them or whatever the case may be, they're not recyclable. So they sit in a dump somewhere just piling up. So how are we reducing waste when we're creating more with a solution that's not sustainable? The second concern that I have is towards agriculture. I'm very concerned that we're cutting into the ability to have sustainable agriculture in our communities. I'm very concerned that we have foreign countries that are buying up our farmlands and infiltrating our food supplies. And I think that it's incredibly important that we preserve that land, come up with sustainable solutions so that in the end, we can reach that point. Now, you hear the United States talk a lot about being net zero, and I'm in favor. If we can get there, okay. But we also have to realize that of the developed world right now, the United States has the lowest percent of CO2 emissions. So let's slow down and let's think of real solutions, sustainable solutions that don't negatively impact the areas in which we live. I have friends that own farms. My friend Alcinda here tonight owns a farm. My new friend Emilio in the back was telling me earlier that he moved here 40 years ago to have land, to be able to preserve that land, and we have to be respectful of that. And we cannot create solutions that take away property or cause more of a problem than they solve.
Mr. Ruffulo, you have a 1-minute rebuttal to this answer.
I think you have to invest in farmland. Virginia has a tremendous amount of farmland that's available. I think the incentives have to start with tax abatements to allow farmers to invest in that land and to protect that land. I think that if we diversify the amount of crops and we spend time actually cleaning the watershed, a variety of the areas that we use are oysters, right? They're full of oyster farms. It's one of the most important things in Virginia. And so a lot more money and a lot more resources has to be spent to first clean what we already have, because all of that goes into your body. All that goes into our children's bodies. So the first part is how do we preserve and clean what we already have. The second part is the development, but it comes again with an incentive for small business. So I was at a particular area out here and I met some farmers, and these farmers were 2 young girls that had just started a sheep shearing business. And I asked them, if we scale the business taxes X level and below, what happens? And they said, we invest in more machines, we invest in more people, and we invest in business. And that's what grows your farms.
Mr. Woolf, a 1-minute rebuttal.
Thank you. I think that we have to be really concerned. I agree with Mr. Ruffulo that we have to be really concerned about the watershed and the impact. I learned tonight, again, as I was speaking to somebody, that as we redirect these water sources, we're draining wells that people need. So again, I go back to my original point, and that is that the solution cannot be worse than the problem itself. We've got to make sure that these are sustainable solutions, and we need to be thinking through them. I remember years ago, I was meeting with some individuals from Europe. We were having a conversation, and this was specific to crime, but they asked me in that conversation, they said, why in the United States are you also reactionary? Why, whenever you see a problem, do you just slap a Band-Aid on it and move on? And it was so insightful, it opened my eyes that if we're going to implement solutions, if we're going to improve our electrical infrastructure, we need to think it through, study it, and have long-term sustainable solutions.
Thank you, and now I want to go back to your 1-minute rebuttals on the first question, which I think you remember, concerning efforts by Democrats to reduce punishment for people that assault police officers and law enforcement. Mr. Woolf, if you'd like to do a 1-minute rebuttal on that, you can, and then I'll go to Mr. Ruffulo.
Thank you, Patty. I think that we have to remember what happens when we use alternative forms of justice or we lower penalties for serious crimes. Crime goes up because it's no longer de-incentivized. We look at cities all across our country that are run by Democrats that have implemented these defund the police and other prosecutorial policies that don't put bad people in jail. And what do we see? We see crime on the rise. In our county alone, homicides have doubled this year. Folks, it's unacceptable. And the only way that we're going to be able to stop it is if we have strict laws that back our law enforcement, give them the ability to do their job, and punish those that choose to break the law.
Mr. Ruffulo, 1-minute rebuttal.
Thank you. I think that the type of sentencing that we're using should be scaled. I think the sentencing has to be appropriate to the crime. I think that we have to use not alternative means, but alternative educational means. I return again to the point of 50% of probably these crimes happens with children. It happens with children because they don't have good mentors, they don't have good role models, and it starts in the school. It starts with curriculum in the school, it starts with what we're teaching children and the morals they're being taught at home. We have to go to a point where the curriculum is a pro-American curriculum. It engages their minds, that gets them involved in after-school programs where they can develop themselves and they can seek an alternative road in life. Without this, you've lost the kids, you've lost the country, and you'll continue to have a portion of the crime that we're now discussing. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to the third question regarding budget issues. Items or areas to cut or reduce spending, or are they worth spending more? Virginia requires a balanced budget. Question 1, do you view this favorably or unfavorably? It's a 3-part question. What items, if any, would you cut or reduce from the state budget? Please be specific. Which areas of the state budget, if any, deserve to have increased funding? How would you accomplish this enrichment? Be specific. And this question goes to Mr. Woolf.
All right, thank you, Patty. So you've heard tonight that there is a surplus in Richmond, and it's just sitting there. And unfortunately, the Democrats are blocking that surplus from being used for anything, regardless of whether you're going to invest in more government programs or you're going to send it back to the taxpayers. Well, I think it's important to understand, I can tell you from my time in government service, that the government tends to screw everything up. So we should not be investing in more services. We need to invest in our communities. We need to make sure that our communities are sustainable and that they have the resources that they need to respond, not more government-run services. So when we talk about cutting the budget, I think we need to find solutions where we can return those services back to the communities and back to the people. I've talked to a lot of faith leaders across our district. I've talked to a lot of individuals that run nonprofit organizations. In fact, I ran a nonprofit for many years. There are good people doing good work out there, and they need to be empowered. And when the government takes the money and tries to use it, they don't use it efficiently, the services don't get to the people, and then those that were intended to be served end up being hurt even more. So we need to cut some of those state-level government programs that are tied through all types of red tape. And if we're going to increase funding, we need to put it in areas where it's smart. Where do we need to put it? First, tax cuts, right? So we need to make sure that we have tax cuts, but we need to make sure that we're funding our police, that they have the tools and resources that they need. In particular, I know we talked about mental health earlier. I think we need to be mindful of the mental health of our first responders and invest in that. And I'm proud that Governor Youngkin is investing money in developing an office of wellness for first responders. Incredibly important that we need to be investing in those types of common sense solutions that will yield results for our community.
just a tiny follow-up. Which specific items would you cut or reduce from the state budget?
I gotta resend it.
Let's do a minute. Let's just
Okay.
do a minute.
So I think that first of all, we need to look at the budget. I think that we need to look at where we're wasting money. One of the things when I worked for the last administration at the federal government, we were tasked with was going in and looking at departmental budgets and seeing where the waste is.
Do you have any specific items that you want to cut? I mean, waste is kind of a general term. It
It
really
is,
doesn't
right.
mean anything. What specific parts of the state budget would you want to cut?
Administrative oversight. There's way too much administration in these in the government programs.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Woolf. Mr. Ruffulo, let me give you the question. Virginia requires a balanced budget. Do you view this favorably or unfavorably? What items, if any, would you cut or reduce from the state budget? Which areas of the state budget, if any, deserve to have increased funding? How would you accomplish this in Richmond?
There's going to be a rebuttal after this,
Specific.
right?
Yes, there is.
Okay, so I think if we look at what needs to be cut, we should start with, how about income tax? I'm not for a large income tax. I would remove income tax, and in fact, I would do it with a scaled sales tax. I would eliminate the meals tax. I would eliminate personal property tax having to do with cars. And in terms of what should be cut out of the budget, I would say that there's a variety of things in Richmond that should be cut out of the budget. I think there's a lot of stuff that has to be analyzed, but before, I would like to talk about increases, and the increase, I think, has to be in education. I think everything starts with, again, with the children, and so I think that the budget has to reverberate, and the Senate has the power to direct the Department of Education to re-examine the curriculum. The curriculum has to drive what happens, and I think the more money has to be spent in education. If I was going to cut anything, I think I would look severely at how they spend the money. I think that they're wantonly needy in terms of their programmatics. I don't think their programmatics are very strong. Why are we paying so much money for tolls on roads? There are a variety of other things that they should be tapping into in Richmond, federal grants, and they're not tapping into any of those federal grants.
I'll follow up with you, and we're gonna give you another minute. Again, I did not hear any specific cuts to the budget. You mentioned, revenue streams that you think should be stopped, but in terms of budget items, what specifically do you want to cut from the state budget?
I think if we were going to look at what to cut from the state budget, I think it would be funding for a variety of other programs, and I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Can you be more specific? Can you give us two things that you would want to cut from the state budget?
Well, I think one of the things that you have to look at cutting from the state budget would be, I actually don't have any answer for that.
Okay. We're going to move on to rebuttals now, and Mr. Woolf, you have 1 minute rebuttal.
Thank you, Patty. So I want to say that I agree that we need, education is an area where we need to invest more. But I think where I may disagree just slightly is I think that we need to be investing in teachers. I think teachers pay, we've talked to some of these teachers that are out here, we're asking them to do more and more in the classroom every day with less money, and we're not attracting good teachers to be able to handle the classrooms that they're working in. So one of the areas that I think that we need to invest in is not state-run curriculum. I think that the state needs to stay out of that. That's an issue for the local school boards to work through. But I do think that the state can support the local school districts in increasing funding to support teachers and to attract highly qualified candidates.
Mr. Ruffulo, 1 minute rebuttal.
I think that if we look at that, I would like to address the surplus, if I may, as my rebuttal to him.
Sure.
And so what I think we need to do is we need to return $1 billion of the budget surplus to you in the form of a tax credit, not let the government decide to give you a check, because that's just going to eat up more of your money. I think we need to look at $1 billion in strategic infrastructure, investing in businesses, in roads, in power supplies, and other things that are dramatically needed, especially in southwestern Virginia. We talked a little bit about economy and farming. I think that there's a tremendous amount of manufacturing that can occur there, and I think that there's people that we can employ. And I think that there's businesses that can be incentivized there. And I think the other part would be half a billion on the program for expectant mothers to allow them, those who are in jeopardy, to perhaps bring children to term and allow us to protect families and protect family values. Thank you.
And we're gonna do 2 more questions because we have time, and then everyone would have had 5 questions. All right, another question about how we, on California, Virginia. We all watched California as they had blackouts due to insufficient electricity, while simultaneously mandating a phase out of the internal combustion engine in motor vehicles and an increase in electric vehicles. Would you encourage or mandate a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy? If so, how would you ensure that there would still be sufficient electricity for increased demands on the electrical grid at a price the consumer can afford? And Mr. Ruffulo, you take that question first.
So I think the first portion of this, you should determine whether you want an electrical stove or whether you want a gas stove. I mean, that's an issue that's near and dear to many people's hearts. If you're a cook, you know how to cook on one stove,
Right.
probably not so well on the other stove. You get stuff that burns in the oven, so it becomes a big travesty. So I think the first part is you should determine how and what type of stove that you have. In terms of electrical power, in terms of the power grid, I think a great deal of work needs to be done with that. And I think part of that is that strategic investment in infrastructure that we're going to conduct if we give $1 billion back to the state for that.
Okay. And Mr. Woolf, I will read the question again. We all watched California as they had blackouts due to insufficient electricity while simultaneously mandating a phase out of the internal combustion engine in motor vehicles and an increase in electric vehicles. Would you encourage or mandate a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy? If so, how would you ensure there's still sufficient electricity for the increased demand on the grid at a price the consumer can afford?
I think that's a great question, Patty. I think it goes a little bit to what we were talking about with the solar issue. We need to make sure that as we grow and we find solutions, they're sustainable, common sense solutions. I don't think that the government should mandate what type of car you should drive. If you want to drive a gas-powered engine, great. If you can afford a Tesla, great. I can't, so the government shouldn't be telling me that I need to go buy one. And the problem is that when they start to mandate things like that, their answer, their solution is always what? Oh, well, we'll just give you a tax credit to go do it. Well, where is that coming from? What is that impacting? They're gonna raise other people's taxes to try to cover the cost. So again, we're not thinking about how these things impact. It goes back to the example I used before. We're slapping a Band-Aid on the problem and we're not thinking through where in the future we're going to end up. I'm concerned about the power grid issues in California, and I think we can look at how it impacts other states. Look at what happened to Texas, was it 2 winters ago? When they had too much demand on the power grid, it shut it down, and what happened? People died. People died because of these solutions. It is unacceptable, and it's not the government's position to mandate things that will ultimately hurt people.
Mr. Ruffulo, you
Yep.
have 1 minute rebuttal.
Well, I would disagree that it's not the government's place to mandate, because the purpose of the government is to provide you with the umbrella infrastructure above every other program. EVs are not possible with the current grid. It's impossible to do because you have to have the appropriate planning, you have to have the appropriate infrastructure, and we don't have that. We can see clearly in California, they've been told, do not plug your cars in, because if you plug your cars in, you're going to flatten the grid. So again, it comes back to infrastructure and investment in strategic infrastructure. This is all a result of poor planning from the government. They don't understand that they've got a pie-in-the-sky objective here, and they don't backwards plan to where they are today to give you the appropriate steps, then look at the policy, then invest the resources, whether those resources are federal, state, or local resources, and they must be all three. It's not a flat paradigm. So I think when we look at the infrastructure, and if we look at our data centers which are coming, Very clearly, you're going to have an investment, which is a larger system, and that's nuclear, and that's going to take you 20 years just to get the permissions, let alone another 20 years to set up the nuclear reactor. Thank you.
Thank you. And a rebuttal from Mr. Woolf. 1 minute.
Thank you, Patty. And I just, want to say thank you for proving the point there in that government screws it up, right? And they are trying to put in solutions without proper infrastructure. And so this is where it's an opportunity for us to slow down and come up with real solutions. And I'll just reiterate my point. The government shouldn't be mandating what type of car you use. The government shouldn't be mandating what type of stove you have in your house. In fact, as I talk to people out in the district, they're more worried about if they're gonna have food to put in that stove and not whether it runs on electricity or gas. Those are the issues for which the government needs to be responsive to. Not this silliness of electricity and gas and other things and mandating it in a way that's not informed and it's not sustainable.
Thank you. And we are on to the last question, which is about election integrity. I'm going to take a couple of liberties with the wording. It appears, certainly based on 2022, that ballot harvesting is here to stay. And for the purposes of this discussion, by ballot harvesting, I mean candidates, parties, ensuring that ballots get to their voters and ensuring those ballots, those completed ballots are retrieved and submitted. Ballot harvesting, it's legal. Doing that is, you can do that. And it's quite clear the Democrats have gotten it down to a science. What is your position on the Republicans becoming proficient in distributing those ballots and retrieving those ballots from our voters? Do you have election fraud concerns about doing that? What is your opinion on ballot drop boxes?
It's me.
It is, yes, yes, you would, no, it would be Mr. Wolf.
That's what I was asking.
I'm so sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't mean
I
to
think
single you out.
we were having this moment.
Yes, I felt it too. Mr. Wolf.
Thank you, Patty. Yeah, I think, the issue of election integrity is an incredibly important issue. At the core of who we are as Americans is our ability to vote. It's we decide the government. The power comes from the people, not the other way around. And so we have to preserve and we have to defend that institution and our ability to do so. I have concerns with the way things are done now. I have concerns with the amount of early voting that's going on. I have concerns with ballot harvesting. And I think that where the government does need to come in is ensuring that they put up appropriate guardrails. I'm concerned about fraud. Now, do I think that our elections are invalid? Absolutely not. We rely on that process, and I believe in that process, and that's why I participate in that process every election cycle, because my voice matters and your voice matters. But it is the duty of the legislature to make sure that those guardrails are in place. And so I think that you're right, ballot harvesting to some extent is here to stay. Some of the things that we've seen, especially that came out of the COVID era, are here to stay. But we've got to make sure that we put the guardrails in place to protect the integrity of the system.
And what about the drop boxes? One of the part of the question was, do you support having drop boxes for ballots?
I don't support having drop boxes for ballots. I think there are plenty of opportunities to cast that vote, whether it's a mail-in ballot or whether it's going in person. I think that there are opportunities for, particularly, I had a great call the other day with a coalition of individuals that are worried about the concerns for those that have disabilities, and talking about even those that have disabilities can do curbside voting. We have made it so easy to vote. Why do we need to create a system that is inherently set up for fraud.
And Mr. Ruffulo, I will try to repeat my somewhat freestyle question. Ballot harvesting is here to stay. By ballot harvesting, I mean getting ballots out to our voters and retrieving those ballots and making sure that they're submitted. Do you support the Republican Party engaging in a massive effort to master that in situations where we need it? Are you concerned about fraud in those situations? And do you support drop boxes?
First, thank you very much for the question. The second part would be, I want to thank Jeff Fuller for all the work that he's done in election integrity, because a lot of what he's talked about has informed the process. As you may be aware, I'm a substitute teacher. I teach down the street. So one of the things, teaching history here in Virginia is very different than the rest of the country. So I learned about the House of Burgesses. So if you're a native Virginian, you know the importance of the House of Burgesses. So regarding the election integrity question, the first thing I would do if I arrived in Richmond would be to propose a new bill, the House of Burgess Election Integrity Act. Sorry, Carol, but mandatory IDs are required to vote, okay? Part two, because I think the question is bigger than just ballot harvesting, limit the early election to only 5 days. And I think that the other thing is, for 10 weeks, I did door knocking for Bob Weir. One of the things I learned looking at the Republican walkbook is that 50% of the houses that we visited, the people who are registered to vote there don't live there. So if you are requesting absentee ballots, those ballots are going into a system that you have no idea who's voting for you. Many people have retired, they've moved to Florida, they've moved to North Carolina, and they've not re-registered. Because if they had re-registered, then that system should cancel out their absentee ballot here. That's not happening. That opens the door for an excessive amount of ballot harvesting, and I think absentee voting should only be by exception, and I think that those ballots are absentee ballots. They should be signature verification against the ID card. The other part of the question is drop boxes, and I think that we have to understand that some people have some limitations. If I was going to do drop boxes, but only be at the precinct headquarters, because I think anything other than that facilitates an excessive amount of ballot harvesting. We've all seen the films from the elections where stuff comes from under the desk. It has to be in a controlled environment. Thank you.
Mr. Woolf, a minute rebuttal.
Thank you. I just want to add sort of the other context to that, right? We have to have a photo ID to buy cigarettes. You have to have a photo ID to buy alcohol. Pretty much anything, board an airplane, anything that you have to do, you have to have a photo ID. But that which we hold most sacred to us as Americans, you don't have to have a photo ID. I think that tells you right there that there's a problem that needs to be fixed. And just to reemphasize, we've got to put those guardrails in place to prevent that fraud from happening in the first place.
Mr. Ruffulo, 1 minute rebuttal.
That's a fantastic soundbite. So your most sacred right is the first constitutional right. It's the right to free speech. And the most important exercise of that right is the vote. And we have to defend that vote, and that's why I would introduce this bill as my first act in Richmond. Thank you.
Good. We are to closing statements. Mr. Woolf, you have 2 minutes for a closing statement.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you all for being here tonight. I know you could be at other places, but this shows how much you care about your community, because you're coming out tonight to be able to make informed decisions when you go to the polls. And so I'm thankful for you all and your commitment to the community. Friends, in November, we have a big and scary decision to make, but it is a decision nonetheless. District 30 can choose to send Delegate Rome to the Senate, to continue the policies that she has pushed forward in the House, to continue to allow crime to rise, to not support our law enforcement, to continue to interfere in our lives and in our children's education. Alternatively, we can choose to send a strong Republican candidate to create a Republican Senate. Our governor has invested a lot of time and energy and is paying attention to what's happening. but in particular, our governor's paying attention to Senate District 30. Because to be able to take the majority in the Senate, we've got to win here in 30. If you choose to send me on, I promise you that I will fight for the residents of District 30. I promise you that I will fight to make your communities safe. I will fight to lower your taxes. I will fight to have a transportation system that works. And I will fight to make sure that the government stays out of your community. My friends, I was a police officer for many years, going after gangs and human traffickers. I've never backed down from a fight. And I promise you, I won't back down from this one. Thank you.
Mr. Ruffulo.
Hi, I'm Robert Ruffulo. I served you for 29 years as an Army Colonel, as a diplomat, as a father to 4 children. Now I serve you as a candidate. I serve you as a teacher of pre-K through 8th grade students. Parents trust me with their kids. I'm going to give you lower taxes. I'm going to give you better schools. In the first Gulf War, my helicopter crashed into the desert. I'm still here. Black Hawk Down, I'm still here. In Uganda, I was mobbed downtown, still here. My 37 parachute jump, I had to pull a reserve, slammed into the ground, I'm still here. I'm here for you, still serving despite all the things that have happened. Send me to Richmond, and I will change the dynamics in Virginia, starting with conservation of your sacred monuments, the execution of your most sacred right, which is the right to free speech. I will defend your Second Amendment rights, constitutional carry. I will defend your families. I will defend our way of life. And if possible, if it's humanly possible, stop those damn data centers from coming out the back door. Okay? Thank you. Thank you to our hosts. Thank you, Patty, for hosting this. Thank you to Moms of Liberty. Thank you to all of our friends here this evening. Have a good night.